Given Kevin De Bruyne's return from injury and Phil Foden's fantastic midfield performances this season, it becomes a question of whether the two can successfully operate in midfield together. Well, actually, there are 3 questions. Can it work? Will Pep even try it? And even if it can work, is it optimal? By the end of this video, you'll have the answers to all 3 of those questions. Leave a comment letting me know whether you think it can work. Let's start with, can it work in theory? On the left of my tactical board is how City generally set up with the ball, and on the right is City's general out of possession shape. For the sake of argument, we're going to assume City have a full strength squad, and we're only going to discuss the current system City primarily utilise. This was City's treble winning team. Gundogan's obviously left the club, so that left central midfield slot has become available. Foden's best performances this season have come from that area of the pitch, and we know that if you play Foden in midfield and give him the ball, based on this season, City usually win and Foden is always the best or one of the best players on the pitch. But it's not as simple as just replacing Gundogan with Foden. What was Gundogan at Man City? Well, he was a controller. He was a midfielder who could flourish in all phases of the game, build-up, progression, and goal-scoring actions. He was overall a more conservative midfielder than De Bruyne, and that control aspect of his game perfectly complemented De Bruyne's more dynamic playstyle. Gundogan was also defensively proficient. He'd regularly fill in for Rodri in defensive midfield when Rodri was unavailable. So when City didn't have the ball, their 4-4-2 midfield structure was solid. Gundogan could sit alongside Rodri with ease and provide excellent defensive coverage. Now let's compare that to Foden. When City have the ball, I don't see any genuine issues. Yes, Foden is much more inclined to get the ball forward as quickly as possible compared to Gundogan. He's a much more dynamic player. He's so more likely to take risks, like De Bruyne. But so long as you have a solid base and more control-based wingers, like Grealish and Bernardo, that should balance out the more dynamic nature of this midfield. We've also seen Foden's maturity in respect of decision-making massively improve in recent games. It's lazy to suggest Foden is a liability on the ball and regularly gives it away. Of course, there were some issues this season, most notably the Crystal Palace game, when he tried to dribble past 3 Palace players in the 90th minute. But that mistake seems to have done him a world of good, something Guardiola himself has alluded to. And in the games against Everton and Sheffield United, Foden made more key passes than gave the ball away. Gundogan's ability to drop deep and connect play was priceless to City, and Foden's been unreal at that recently. I personally see a midfield partnership of Foden and De Bruyne a terrifying proposition. City have been crying out for central thrust and creativity this season, which we only see consistently when Foden's played there. Reintroducing De Bruyne also solves most of City's right-sided issues this season. Those iconic De Bruyne half-space crosses will make a return. Haaland will now know he'll have 2 midfielders desperate to find his runs with line-breaking passes, and the press resistance and technical ability of that box midfield is off the charts. I've never had my doubts on whether it could work in possession. This boils down to how Man City set up without the ball. Foden hasn't frequently been used in midfield this season without the ball. It's happened 1 or 2 times, most notably against RB Leipzig, when the out-of-possession shape actually changed to a 4-3-3. Not often enough for it to be reliable against the best opposition. What happens instead depends on the players on the pitch. In scenario 1, when both Alvarez and Haaland are on the pitch, Foden's off-ball position is actually right wing. When City are in settled possession, Alvarez drops back into left central midfield, Walker pushes up to right wing, and Foden tucks inside to right central midfield. De Bruyne would be swapped in for Alvarez in this instance. In scenario 2, when only one of Alvarez or Haaland are on the pitch, Foden plays alongside the striker without the ball, and then drops into left central midfield with the ball. De Bruyne would be swapped in for whoever's playing as the right central midfielder in this instance. Both can work, but both have their flaws when we introduce De Bruyne into the mix. Scenario 1 in its current form cannot work because it would require Foden and De Bruyne to play in positions which aren't optimal. De Bruyne's brilliant right-footed passes and crosses would be less efficient on the left, and likewise with Foden's bias towards his favoured left foot. It's also not as simple as swapping them around. The reason this currently works is because of Foden's ability to play right midfield without the ball. De Bruyne hasn't been asked to do this on a consistent basis since Pellegrini was the manager. There's also the question of De Bruyne's fitness and injury concerns. City's wide players are tasked with a major amount of defensive and pressing burden. Ideally, we should be minimising the off-ball responsibilities of De Bruyne as he's getting older and becoming more injury-prone. Putting him on the right also lessens his threat in transition. When City received the ball on the counter-attack last season, De Bruyne was close to Haaland, almost acting like a second striker at times. Moreover, this would require Walker to act as the right winger when City have the ball. and whilst he would no doubt perform better offensively if De Bruyne was alongside him, Walker is still relatively poor going forwards, and with our right back at right wing, it means City are vulnerable to opposition counterattacks down the right. So in its current form, I don't think scenario 1 is feasible. However, it could become feasible with a slight tweak. Instead of the right back progressing to the right wing, why not move the left back to left wing when we have the ball? We've seen Gvardiol do this already to allow Grealish to play more centrally. Gvardiol is much better on the ball than Walker, and he's not looked out of place when tasked with playing that advanced. He has a brilliant relationship with Foden when they play near each other, and it would mean that, without the ball, Foden could simply move over to left wing, a defensive task he's done regularly. Once again, it's not ideal because it would mean not playing Grealish or Doku, and you've still got a defender as one of your attacking players, but this would allow for City's out-of-possession shape with minimal deficiencies. It makes good use of Gvardiol's on-ball abilities, and it gets Foden and De Bruyne into their best positions. So that's the scenario when a fullback pushes up to become a winger. How about when a defender pushes up into midfield, the John Stones role? This is scenario 2. Without the ball, one of the two offensive midfielders becomes a striker, and the other drops alongside Rodri. This is where the problems arise, because that position, alongside the striker, is the favoured position of both Foden and De Bruyne. Obviously, only one of them can play there, so one of them will have to drop alongside Rodri, just how Gundogan used to do. On paper, De Bruyne would be the best candidate for this. His defensive work rate is underrated, and we've seen him play as an out-and-out box-to-box midfielder before for City, as he did in the 2020 season. Technically, it's something he can do very easily. But as with my reservations of De Bruyne playing right midfield without the ball, I echo the same concerns. At this stage in his career, returning from awful hamstring injuries, City must preserve and manage De Bruyne's energy output. It's also not as simple as doing what we did in the Centurion season where both David Silva and De Bruyne played ahead of the defensive midfielder in what was basically a 4-1-4-1. Rodri can't cover all this space on his own. I don't think anyone currently playing in world football can do it to the level required. The reason that worked was because David Silva and De Bruyne had Fernandinho behind them, one of the only defensive midfielders capable of such a Herculean task. So if we don't want De Bruyne to drop alongside Rodri, and if Rodri can't cover the space on his own, the only alternative is to trust Foden in that position. Now, I think Foden could do this to a brilliant standard in the future, with time and experience, but in the biggest games, in the now, there are huge question marks of whether he'd be able to do that. Does he yet have the defensive acumen and maturity to replicate what Gundogan offered in that position without the ball? Would he be a defensive liability? Would he be able to offer Rodri enough support? This is the crux of whether scenario 2 would work. If Foden can play midfield without the ball, it would be the perfect utilisation of City's players. If not, it would create midfield disarray. And that leads us nicely into whether Pep would even try this. I think the answer to that is, it depends. Pep's trust in Foden is clearly growing based on his comments of Foden's recent performances, so it's not as clear-cut as Pep would never try to get both Foden and De Bruyne into midfield. In fact, there's strong evidence to suggest he will. Take a look at City's first starting 11 of the Premier League season, the first and only league game to feature De Bruyne before his injury. Foden's starting position of left wing isn't important. What is important is the fact Haaland, Alvarez, and De Bruyne all started. De Bruyne was only on the pitch for around 20 minutes, but I've rewatched this part of the game multiple times, and this was City's actual formation that day. In possession, there's nothing particularly interesting. Lewis inverted in midfield, and De Bruyne and Alvarez were the two offensive midfielders, like how we've seen both Foden and Alvarez play this season. What was interesting, however, was what happened in those brief moments when City didn't have the ball. Rodri was primarily partnered in midfield with Alvarez. Pep trusted a striker to perform the defensive responsibilities of a central midfielder off the ball. I think it's reasonable to presume we can therefore swap out Alvarez for Foden. Whatever defensive deficiencies Foden may or may not have, he's much more solid defensively in midfield than a striker in midfield. Clearly, Pep is comfortable with the concept of having both Foden and De Bruyne in midfield. Otherwise, we never would have seen Alvarez and De Bruyne in midfield. And this is where the "it depends" answer comes into play. If the opposition is weaker, I think Pep has zero issues playing Foden and De Bruyne together in the middle, and trusting Foden to play alongside Rodri when the off-ball structure is less important. If the opposition is stronger, however, if we're playing at Anfield, against Arsenal, or in the latter stages of the Champions League, I doubt Foden's trusted with that defensive burden. And that takes us to the final question this video sought to answer. Is a midfield pairing of Foden and De Bruyne even optimal? Obviously, we won't know for sure until we see it, but given the amount of caveats and qualifiers I've had to include with every explanation in the current system and in the biggest games, I think it makes more sense to give Gundogan's position to Bernardo and Bernardo's to Foden. Yes, City have struggled on their right this season. When Foden's played there, he's been less effective for the most part. But De Bruyne returning fixes that deficiency. We already know that Bernardo in the midfield provides control and defensive discipline, so it doesn't introduce midfield dynamic issues. And let's not forget Foden's brilliant start to last season before his injuries, where the majority of those appearances came on the right. I'm still strongly of the belief that Foden's a midfielder, that his best position is in midfield, specifically left of centre, that he can definitely work in midfield alongside De Bruyne. The City's best team would have Foden and De Bruyne in midfield, and that maybe next season, that should be the first choice midfield. But context. Chiefly the context of De Bruyne's injury concerns, Foden's lack of experience in midfield without the ball. In the current system, it's perhaps not as simple as we'd want it to be. Outside of the biggest games, and in the first instance, we need to see it. I want to see it in the biggest games too, maybe for an entire half initially. If it doesn't work, just swap Bernardo and Foden round. Problem solved. So, can De Bruyne and Foden play together in midfield? Yes. Will Pep try it? It depends. Is it optimal to do so in the current system? I'd like to think so, but until I see it in action, I don't think anyone has the answer to that. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like on the video to watch more videos like this. Subscribe to the channel. Catch you guys next time.